Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're just going to wait a couple minutes here for everyone to log in. Thank you for joining us. And thanks so much if you joined us for our last event as well. Let's see. I see a bunch of people logging in now. If you're just joining us, we're going to get started in just a couple minutes here. Thanks for your patience. And Ibrahim, I don't know if you can see the chats coming in, but we have a thank you from Christine Edmonds from the Advancement Office for joining us.
Ah, yes. Oh, yeah, I do see the chats and the attendees.
Great. Okay. So I imagine we'll probably have some more people joining us throughout the presentation. It sounds like some of the alumni chat rooms ran a little long and they're just wrapping up now.
Okay.
But let's get started. Welcome, everybody. I'd love to introduce you to Dr. Ibrahim Al Marashi from the class of 1991. He's an assistant professor of Middle East history at California State University, San Marcos. He has a doctorate of philosophy from the University of Oxford, an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown University, and 3 BAs from UCLA and UC San Diego, which I have to say is very impressive. He has taught at Cal State San Marcos, IE University in Spain, University of Pennsylvania, Bosphorus University, and Sabancı University in Turkey, as well as the Monterey Institute of International Studies in California. He has served as an International Policy Fellow in the Center for Policy Studies in Central European History in Hungary, and has written 3 books: The Modern History of Iraq with Phoebe Marr, Iraq's Armed Forces, An Analytical History with Sami Salama, and more recently, A Concise History of the Middle East. And Ibrahim is actually back by popular demand. He gave a presentation to our students this past spring semester, and we're so excited to have him here. He's actually joining us from Madrid at the moment. And is it midnight there, did you say?
It is midnight.
So thank you so much for staying up late for us. I'm about to hand it over here, but please feel free to submit questions. We'll definitely take some time at the end. You can just use the Q&A box or the chat, and I will hand it over. Thank you.
Very good. Actually, I literally just got through the door about 15 minutes ago. I just landed in Madrid. So my pleasure. It was surreal because I left San Francisco. I guess it would have been yesterday, Friday at 7:30 p.m. And San Francisco International, at least the international terminal, was empty, absolutely empty. So in other words, I am teaching about, I'm giving you the historical perspective on the subject, but we're also living through a very historical epoch ourselves. I mean, I don't know when in history was San Francisco International ever that empty. But the same, I had to transfer London Heathrow. It was the same in London. London's airport, the busiest transportation hub in the world, was also empty. And then I just arrived in Madrid. It's midnight and 95 degrees Fahrenheit outside. So it's been quite a journey. And Whereas, yeah, so literally I was in Monterey. I just left Monterey now and just arrived in Spain. And I've been teaching in Spain as a visiting professor since January 2020. And just to open up this lecture, I posed a question to my students in Spain in January 2020, but let me pose a question to you, the audience. And you could go ahead, try to chat on the chat function, see if you could, I'm curious what your answer would be. So the question I have for all of you, if I'm saying we're living through a historically, let's say historically challenging times, I want you to think in the beginning of the 20th century. I'm sorry, that time flew. In the beginning of the 21st century. So when it turned the year 2000. So here we are in 2020, but once we hit the year 2000, I want you to think of what non-governmental organization, in other words, what NGO had the greatest impact on international relations in terms of global affairs? What NGO transformed our world in the 21st century? What answer would you give me in terms of a non-governmental organization that? So the International Monetary Fund is a good answer. The Gates Foundation is definitely a good answer, and it's very much prevalent now. But I would still say there's an NGO that, even more than the Gates Foundation, even more than the IMF, that transformed the world that we lived in, that transformed our sense of being. So what NGO would that be? What non-governmental organization? So Doug, you do have, you're almost there. Al-Qaeda. Yes, that's the answer I'm looking for. And so thank you, Mr. Key, for giving us the answer to today's quiz. Most people cannot think of Al-Qaeda as an NGO. But technically, is it a non-governmental organization? Absolutely. It does not belong to a single government. And does it consider itself an organization? Absolutely. In fact, its official title is Tanzim al-Qaeda, the Al-Qaeda organization. Usually I throw these questions to students because in their frame of thinking, they're not used to think of terrorist groups as NGOs. But think of how Al-Qaeda transformed the 21st century. There's a reason why I started off our lecture with San Francisco International. Think in terms of even in your daily routines, when you have to travel, let's say even within state, all the security checks, taking off your shoes, all of that has to basically is a reminder of the transformation of our daily lives as a result of the attacks of 9/11. Now, this was an NGO that really struck our sense of, really kind of brought out our sense of vulnerability. And so there is a continuum, I would say, between this NGO and COVID-19. So what's the continuum? So that's the NGO as of 2001. Now we get to the year 2020. It's January 2020, and I'm giving my first lecture. This is a lecture, it's a class on the history of international relations. And with that first lecture, I didn't have any notes prepared. I asked the students, you give me the topic. This is international history. You give me the topic. For a lot of those kids, this was the first lecture of their decade, the first lecture of 2020. And basically, this is the question I asked about. What are you most scared of as we enter the new decade? There's 60 students in the auditorium. 45 answered World War III. Now think what was happening when we began 2020. The Trump administration had ordered an assassination of an official within the Iranian military. And what was the most dominant Google search around that time? It was World War III. Is there such a, does the draft still exist? Particularly for our people in the US. Yeah, the fear was that a world war was going to break out. For those 45, just like with the NGO question, I said, that's not the right answer. That's not the answer I was looking for. That's not what you should be scared of. What you should be scared about is a virus emerging in Wuhan province. That was January, but I knew back then, I said, this is what's going to transform global affairs. There's no going back after as a result of this virus. Now, if in January, most of the students still thought of it as a virus in China. It was still a problem in China. It was still maybe a problem in Asia. But here is the connection now. What is the connection between that NGO that transformed global affairs as of 2001 and COVID-19? So in other words, when I'm throwing these questions to you, and what I do as a professor, what do I say is to anticipate. Well, not even anticipate. Let's forget about anticipating global threats. Let's just see a way of looking at the world. You see, I know why those students answered World War III. They are studying international relations. They think of the world in nations. Same with NGOs. When they think of NGOs, they think the Gates Foundation, they think Greenpeace. So you're programmed in a certain way. Of course, if they're studying international relations, what was the thing that would scare them? A war between two nations. Why did I tell them you gave me the wrong answer? Why did I know that COVID-19 should be the thing that they're scared of? Now I want you to reimagine geography. And this is a geographical zone. In other words, when we think of geography in terms of nation states, that worked during the Cold War. There was the US, there was the Soviet Union, and then there was a war over various nation states. Will they remain capitalist? Will they go communist? Think the Cold War then, Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the war in Afghanistan. And yes, imagining the world in that historical epoch of the Cold War as a conflict between nation states worked. That's the way the world worked. As we enter the 21st century, NGOs transformed our global order. In other words, James Bond got it right. If George Orwell really described the Cold War, and if you think of we owe actually, if we think about politics and who am I influenced by, we owe Orwell a lot. Orwell was the prophet of the Cold War. Not only the prophet, if you're thinking 1984, but also people don't realize he gave us the term, the Cold War. It was an essay written called The Atom Bomb and You, where he predicted, so this was just in October, right after, if we're talking, it's the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima. It's also the 71st anniversary of that essay in October, which reminds me, that would make a good article for me to write. Yes, so what did he say? What will happen? What did he prophesize? Remember, this is just a writer. Here's English literature going geopolitical. He prophesied that a world with atomic weapons is going to become a reality. In other words, you see, he didn't see the atomic bomb just staying in the US. He knew that the Soviets would have to get it, and then the British, and so on and so forth. And then what did he prophesize? What was he saying? The atom bomb and you. What was he saying? That in a world full of atomic weapons, conventional war would be too dear, it would be too costly. And what would emerge? A peace that is not a peace, a Cold War. And from Orwell, we have the system of, we have our history from 1945 to 1991. Who was the prophet of the 21st century? It was Ian Fleming. And again, if you could see kind of the power of the imagination, what did Ian Fleming predict? Well, think of all his villains. Think of Dr. No. It was the superpowered individual who posed a threat to global security. Replace Dr. No with Osama bin Laden. And then now think of his replacement, who is a doctor, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. In that case, James Bond got it right. Now, who is the writer who predicted COVID? I'll tell you at the end of the lecture. But, so now I want to go from how literature can help us kind of understand the world we live in. And now let's go to geography. How does geography shape us? And the geographical zone I'm going to talk about, probably you haven't heard. I know of this geographical zone, again, because of a historian who described an area that he called Zomia, Zomia. And where is Zomia? Zomia stretches from the mountains of Afghanistan. So imagine the Hindu Kush mountains, stretches into Pakistan, India, and China. And if I tell you the area that is the fulcrum, Pakistan, India, and China, that's an area known as Ladakh. It's at the foothills of the Himalayas. And just a month ago, a war could have broken out between two nuclear powers, India and China, or in Ladakh. Okay, we're still in this mountainous region that begins with the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan, goes through Ladakh, then then continues through the Himalayas, then goes through the mountainous jungle, rich forest area of Yunnan province in China, and then forms a continuum up into the highlands of Laos and Vietnam. And why did this historian call it Zomia? Because it was a mountainous. This was an area in which armies could not march into. In other words, if we look at this kind of if we're doing broad historical geography, there's been broad historical geographical zones that we could call the Mediterranean. We owe the broad Mediterranean. If we look at the Mediterranean as a geographical zone, the greater Mediterranean, what is its historical legacy? It gave us three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all emerged if we're looking at the Mediterranean as a geographical zone. What did Zomia give us? Well, not much, in the sense that no civilization, quote unquote, could be established in Zomia, in this mountainous zone that reaches from Afghanistan all the way to the hills of Vietnam. This is a place where peoples went to escape armies. This is a place where settled agriculture was impossible, where mass conglomerations, where you have no massive cities. That's the broad historical history of Zomia. Armies could never go there. There's no great cities. It's not a great agricultural zone. And for that reason, it tended to be neglected in history. What is interesting if we look at the Zomia as a contiguous zone, it's in the mountains of the Hindu Kush in which Al-Qaeda sought refuge and planned 9/11. Now, what did I say? This is an area where armies do not march into, whether we're talking about the historical period. Look how hard the American army has had of controlling the Afghan end of Zomia. I mean, still to this day, they never conquered it. They weakened Al-Qaeda, but the US and then the Afghan National Army has never subdued the mountains of Afghanistan. The Soviets tried it and failed. Then I want you to think, okay, so from that part of Zomia, we have 2001 and the last 2 decades that we call the global war on terror. That was called by the Bush administration, the global war on terror. Then let's get to the Yunnan province and continuing into Vietnam. Now, this is quite a jungleless region. I'm sorry, it's a jungle region, right? And it happens to be a place where there just happens to be a very high concentration of bat caves. It's from the Yunnan province that most likely a virus emerged amongst bats that caused the first SARS epidemic. Now look at the word I'm using there, epidemic. Epidemic is when a virus goes out of control in a particular geographical zone. And now here's where the history comes in. It's most likely also a bat. Now, I'm not necessarily sure it emerged in Yunnan province. The SARS virus of 2002 definitely emerged in Yunnan. We're not sure where COVID-19, or in other words, the second SARS virus emerged from. It could be in Vietnam. But what we do know is, now Yunnan is just the Chinese province north of Vietnam. What does the science tell us? That people in Laos, Vietnam, and Yunnan have antibodies that seems to have given them some kind of protection for this second round of SARS. And if you look at the rates of infections in Vietnam, they were quite low. Now, what did I say of Zomia? Zomia was a secluded zone. In other words, armies couldn't march into there. You never had mass inhabitation. Then what did we have going into the 21st century? Zomia was eventually conquered, not by armies, but by mining companies, by deforestation, by what's called, quote unquote, civilization, by urban sprawl. And what did we have twice? As China's economy advanced and you had more urbanization, you had something phenomenal. In the 21st century, you had coronavirus in the span of human history, up until the year 2000. So in the span of human history. So in other words, where do coronaviruses come from? It comes from the domestication of animals. When humans first started to domesticate the horse, and where was the horse domesticated? North of Zomia, the steppe lands. The domestication of the horse gave us a virus that today has evolved into the common cold. Since then, we've had 4 coronaviruses make a zoonotic jump, a jump from animals into humans. Then in the 21st century, something astonishing happened. Within the span of 20 years, 3 coronaviruses made a jump from wildlife populations into human populations. That should be a wake-up call. That should be telling us something is going wrong with the way humanity is interacting with the environment. And particularly in this zone of Zomia, where we had 2 coronaviruses. The 3rd coronavirus emerged from bats that infected camels in Saudi Arabia. It's known as Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. So going forward, what do I tell my students is this: we have to reimagine threats, not the fixation on nation states. And and the current administration is very much an administration that focuses on nation states: North Korea, Iran, China. The challenges of the 21st century won't be nation states. Those are usually, those kind of challenges are usually constructed by other nation states. They don't exist there physically. They are the creations of leaders trying to find enemies for a variety of purposes. Going into the 21st century, what I want to go into now is the other realm that I study. Often it's said that, look what COVID-19 demonstrated to us, that if the world really wanted to, we could shut down those industries that damage the environment. Then what was the fear? That with all the attention on COVID-19, all the momentum behind the climate change movement, of addressing climate change, of reaching the goals of 2030, would be forgotten or neglected. What I argue is that they are not mutually exclusive. COVID-19 and climate change are both challenges that emerge on a continuous spectrum. And what I term these challenges, a geologist came up with a term called the Anthropocene. And how did this geologist come up with the term? Well, he was sitting in a conference where they were referring to the Holocene, which was supposed to be our current geological epoch. And so just so you know, you have these major scenes, okay, which are these major geological epochs, and then you have sub-epochs within them, such as the Jurassic, okay? Now, what did this person say? That we're no longer in the Holocene, we're in the Anthropocene. In other words, what was he arguing? Modernity has set humanity onto a trajectory where humans are now changing the environment for the worse. Now a debate emerged. When does the Anthropocene begin? But let's just say for this lecture, we're in the Anthropocene. Now, I want to take this geologist's term, and I like it because as a historian, it gives me a temporal base to say, from this point onward, something is happening. And what I say we're entering is now in an age that the nation states have to adopt to anthropogenic politics. If the Cold War was balancing against nation states, now nation states have to anticipate and mitigate challenges coming from the environment. In other words, there is no doubt. We're not sure exactly where COVID-19 emerged. Was it the bat caves in Yunnan province? Now, you heard, of course, of Wuhan. But no, Wuhan is just simply where the virus got carried to. And we're still not even sure, did it break out in the wet market? It just happened to be there was a lot of cases in that wet market. And it could have been just a lot of animal handlers were going from Yunnan provinces where they catch the wildlife and bringing it to that particular market. But most viruses, and this isn't the only one, COVID-19, Zika, Ebola, and we tend to forget, and probably around the turn of the century, AIDS. Now here's a continuum. All of them emerged because humans were going into wildlife habitats that they had never entered before, where there were reservoirs of viruses that were contained in those reservoirs. The minute humanity entered these kind of wildlife areas and started to exploit them for building railroads, for timber, for sapping rubber, for sapping palm oil, all of those created new venues or new vectors for viruses to jump into humans. And this is something we have to be cognizant about. Deforestation not only destroys the Earth's carbon sinks, which are so crucial to climate change, deforestation also puts us into greater contacts with viruses. And that's how I say there's an age of anthropogenic politics. This is why I'm saying how climate change and this current outbreak is linked. And that from kind of a great historical perspective, this is what we have to anticipate. Now, of course, I'm making this argument, but again, I'm doing this thanks to another writer. And I conclude with this writer, and his book is excellent. His name is Lawrence Wright. He's a writer for The New Yorker. And of course, he made his name writing about that NGO I talked about in the beginning, Al-Qaeda. Then he wrote a novel. And the novel he wrote is called The End of October. And what is this novel about? How a virus would transform global politics. Now, this is the strange thing. When did this book come out? It came out in March 2020. In other words, he had been writing it since 2015. In other words, here was a writer who also saw the writing on the wall. What would be the potential of a virus transforming global politics? Even the way the Trump administration would react, he got that down almost to a T. Of course, I mean, he's not a prophet, but it's quite amazing just how much research this writer did. And I highly recommend reading the novel, The End of October. But he also makes the link, and I won't, without giving away, that climate change and pandemics, they're both global problems, and they both should be imagined as problems that are linked. Okay, very good. I'll conclude there. I wanted to keep it under 30 minutes, so I just got it on the nose. So I'll open it up to questions.
Well, great. Thank you. That was so fascinating. And please, everyone, submit your questions either through the chat or through the Q&A box here. And in the interim, let's see here. There we go. You know, you talk a lot about kind of civilizations trespass kind of into protected animal environments. What would you say, you know, if you had all the power in the world to kind of correct, what would you say is our path forward to kind of, you know, fix these problems that are happening?
Well, so if I had the powers in the world, first of all, you see problems, well, it depends what kind of problems. The powers of the American president or like a divine entity like powers. So I'll tell you, let's go back to last summer when we had the Brazilian fires, the forest fires, okay? And what are some European countries trying to do now is to prevent forests from being, well, to prevent deforestation. You have various European countries actually taking stewardship over a lot of the forests, so they're prevented from exploitation. It would be some kind of approach like that. So let's, I mean, so if we have all the powers in the world, let's look at some of the problems. The exploitation of forests. We haven't talked about the other major reason for it. It's for farming, for grazing land. Okay? And that is intimately tied to the consumption of animal proteins. And in theory, the next pandemic could be an avian flu. And that would occur because we eat chickens. Forests are being deforested for cows, for the consumption of animal proteins. And if we think of COVID-19, COVID-19 began because most likely animal proteins were consumed. And this is why a good number of wildlife hunters, why there is a wildlife industry, that it provides meat for, for upscale as kind of these delicacies within China. So in other words, I mean, I'll be a hypocrite if I say this because I still consume meat, but I mean, one major way to, prevent these problems is we all have to go vegetarian or become flexitarians or kind of reduce our consumption of animal proteins. I mean, if I'm looking at it systemically, and if I look at avian flus, that's chickens, boom. Swine flus, that's pork. Even we haven't had a great cow disease since the mad cow, but even measles, smallpox probably came from the consumption of beef. Tuberculosis, it came from the consumption of cows. So we got, yes, and so in other words, it's going to require kind of a rethinking of our interaction with the environment. And the environment isn't just, forests, it's the actual, the inhabitants of these areas. Keep in mind, going vegetarian, of course, this is a first world luxury, because you have to realize in Africa, a lot of the, let's say AIDS or Ebola occurs because, people there consume bushmeat, not out of choice, but because, it's, they're, starving. But that also could be the next pandemic. So in other words, this is a problem that's going to require alleviation of hunger. It's going to require reorienting the way we consume animal proteins, then combined with all the things we depend on forests for, such as, well, we deforest for soybeans. Those are consumed. Our use of timber. These are all the great rethinks that civilization is going to have to do to avoid another pandemic. Then there's kind of more concrete, easier, not easier measures, but there are other measures, and that's more realistically, let me put it, that where I don't really have to require that much power. Invest in disease surveillance. And the program there are numerous programs that are meant to surveil potential zoonotic transfers. And one of the most critical ones was defunded by the Trump administration a little bit before COVID broke out. So that was also, that was a major policy failing.
So we have quite a bit of work cut out for us, I think, in the future. And it looks like we have a question from Adam Broadsley, who is our last panelist. Hi, Adam. Thanks for joining. And it says, why are people fighting the wisdom of science? Why can't society agree on what is going on? And the big question, is there hope for humanity? It's a good question.
Okay, so why are people fighting the wisdom of science? We gotta realize where are we questioning this, and it's a big problem in the U.S. It's not such a big problem, and living abroad puts things in perspective. It's not such a major problem in Spain. It's more of a fringe element in Germany, for example. But this is a problem we have in the U.S. We have to call it out, that there's something going wrong in our science education. And having lived abroad, the wisdom of science is questioned by fringes in various countries, Spain or Germany, but it's not as bad as it is in the US. So why can't society agree on what is going on? We have to say, what is it about American society? Where even at this moment, what happened? Why didn't, if we think about divisions, let's say after the attacks of Pearl Harbor, it's quite amazing. Was there something that happened? You didn't have people, storming the State House of Sacramento when FDR declared war, for example. So there's something going on, because what's going on in society, that's sociology. So we have to ask ourselves from a sociological perspective, what's going on in the US? And is there hope for humanity? Well, when push comes to shove, and we saw with the lockdowns, just how kind of Earth was able to take a breather, so to speak. It seems there is. And, I was living in Madrid during the last round of climate negotiations. And, you saw a momentum that it seemed like there was no going back. That finally, okay, I mean, forget about the problems in the US, but at least, and, things could change in November 2020. But still, it seemed like there was now some kind of no going back in terms of addressing climate change. So I would say, yes, there is hope. It's all a matter of willpower. It's the same willpower that determines, can I, not go a month without eating beef, and the same willpower that says, can I take public transportation, and the same willpower for various politicians to say, can I commit to carbon reductions or meeting the national carbon reduction targets. So I would say there's hope.
That's good. Good to hear. And it looks like we have a question from Mitchell Evan, who is joining us from Germany. He says, not the anti-science fringe, I hope. And he asks, how relevant was the so-called Spanish flu for today's current pandemic and the risks of future ones like you described?
So the Spanish flu, and literally this entire lecture I came up with on the plane. So I was meant to talk about the Black Death and the Spanish flu, but then I just got off onto a tangent. So the Spanish flu is extremely relevant in terms of history. And I'll tell you why. It goes to show us that there were even anti-mask protests back then, that the skepticism of science even existed back then. So they allow, so the importance of the Spanish flu is it puts things in perspective. How a virus is not just a biological problem, it's socio-political. The importance of the Spanish flu is this. Never mind the skeptics back then. The importance of the Spanish flu is embedded in the name. It's called the Spanish flu because around World War I, there was wartime censorship regimes in place. And it was only in Spain where there was not a party to the First World War, where the media was allowed to report on it and thus alert the public to an influenza pandemic. And the lesson then from the Spanish flu, and even its mistaken name, if we call this the China virus, as the current administration does, then we would be making the same mistake of the Spanish flu. We'd be using that same mistaken nomen. What does that teach us? The Spanish flu teaches us about the need for free flow of scientific information. Now, in the age of Spanish flu, there was no Facebook and conspiracy theories. But nonetheless, you still had challenges to the free flow of information. That's the key takeaway from the Spanish flu, is there were scientists talking back then, and a good number of them were ignored. And also the need for free media. And this is a great hypothetical question, a counterfactual. If China had a free media, or at least just a free media dealing with science fairs, could this crisis have been averted? I think it might have. It might have. I mean, again, it's a counterfactual, but I think a free media would have made a huge difference in preventing it from going out of control in China.
Well, looks like those are all the questions we have right now.
Wonderful.
Unless anyone else submits one quickly here. But, we've had people joining us. You're in Madrid. We have guests from Germany to Monterey. So, it's really exciting to see York alumni kind of spread all over the globe. And it's been wonderful to have you here with us. And thanks again for staying up so late.
My pleasure. Good night from my end. Good night, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everybody. Take care, and thanks for being a part of our 2020 virtual reunion, and go Falcons. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.